We'll be starting our program in a moment. Hello, everyone. My name is Max Latona, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Ethics in Society here at St. Anselm College. I'm happy to welcome all of you to today's program entitled Honorable Business, a Framework for Business in a Just and Humane Society. Today's program takes place as part of our Ethics in Governance Forum and is actually the second installment in our new series, Corporations and the Common Good. It's a series that explores whether and how businesses should respond to prominent social issues. We're very excited about this series. So these are important questions. Can businesses be just? Can they contribute meaningfully to the common good, to society? Do they need to balance their profit making by advancing social issues important to their stakeholders? I know that there are many people who are actually skeptical of businesses in this regard. And I want to share with you a portion of an email that the center recently received about this topic, a very short snippet. So the author of this email writes, "Our society, quote, has shown again and again that there is no such thing as just business. It's capitalism or equity, and they are mutually exclusive. We've had decades of war, injustice, and corruption, which are the terms on which capitalism survives." The author of this email concludes, quote, "Stop filling people up with fairy tales about a compromise, about businesses being just," end quote. So you see, these are actually very controversial questions and issues. And so we're eager to hear what our speaker can tell us today about these questions of businesses and justice. But before we turn to our speaker, I just have a few notes. First, the funding for this Ethics and Governance Forum and this series comes from a $2 million endowment created by the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office and the Center for Public Responsibility and Corporate Citizenship, awarded to St. Anselm College in 2013. The endowment was actually created by a settlement reached between the New Hampshire Securities Bureau and Tyco International Ltd. In 2002 and is administered by the University of New Hampshire Foundation. Also, to learn more about the forum and our Corporations for the Common Good and the Common Good series, please do visit our website, anselm.edu/ethics. Please note that you will have a chance to ask questions or offer comments, but please don't use the chat function, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And you're welcome to pose a question as they occur to you during the remarks of our speaker today. You don't have to wait till he concludes. I am required by state law to inform you that this event will be recorded. One final remark. Closed captioning is available for those who may have a hearing impairment, and it can be found at the bottom of your screen on the right, where you'll see CC and live transcript. If the closed captioning is occurring and you don't need it, and you find it a distraction, you can also turn it off using that same key. If you open it up, it'll say hide transcript. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Jason Sorens, who is the director of the Center for Ethics, and Professor Dina Frutos-Benzi, who is the professor of international business at St. Anselm College. They will serve as our introducers for our speaker and moderators for the discussion. So Jason and Dina, it's all yours.
Thank you, Max. And I am very pleased to welcome my friend, James Otteson. Professor Addison is the John T. Ryan Jr. Professor of Business Ethics and Rex and Alice E. Martin Faculty Director of the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership in the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. He received his BA from Notre Dame and his PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He specializes in business ethics, political economy, the history of economic thought, and 18th century moral philosophy. His books include Adam Smith's Marketplace of Life, Actual Ethics, Adam Smith, The End of Socialism, The Essential Adam Smith, Honorable Business, and The Essential David Hume. He has 2 books forthcoming: Seven Deadly Economic Sins, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press this year, and The Ethics of Wealth Redistribution with Stephen McMullen, forthcoming from Rutledge next year. And I just want to note that this is the second lecture in our Corporations in the Common Good series, looking at how businesses should respond to controversial social issues. And during this presentation, you are welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function. If you use the chat function, it'll only go to panelists, so no one else will see it. So please use that Q&A function anytime during the presentation. I'm very pleased now to welcome Professor James Otteson.
Thank you very much, Jason and Max and everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And I also appreciate the email that you read, or from which you read, Max. One of the high privileges, but also the great responsibilities I think we have as academics at colleges and universities is to engage controversial issues, and to do so in such a way that is both civil but still challenging. And I think that's a very important right that we have, and it's an obligation as well. So thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen here, and let's just hope that this works. I will assume that you can see that. So the title of my talk is Honorable Business. And I think the first question that we have to ask is, well, is there really such a thing as honorable business? Even talking about that might be something of a strange topic. And I just give you a couple of articles and a book. There's been quite a bit of writing, even recently, about whether business can be honorable. Here you have some articles from the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2018 and 2019 that said that business schools shouldn't even be at universities. Business schools have no business in the university, abolish the business major. And a book came out in 2019 from a historian named Stephen Kahn. He's at Miami University of Ohio. Nothing Succeeds Like Failure, the Sad History of American Business Schools. And I'll give you one more. There's a lot of literature out there about this, and I'm sure there's a lot of sentiment that many of you have heard. But here is a study. It was actually a compilation of 7 different studies that came out a couple of years ago that found, as you can see, I have it highlighted there. In 7 studies, we show that people see business profit as necessarily in conflict with the social good. So notice that it's not that it might be in conflict with the social good, but it's necessarily in conflict with the social good. So as Jason mentioned, my PhD is in philosophy. And one of the things that I found curious when I first began teaching in a business school is how many students in business schools are actually defensive about the fact, maybe even embarrassed about the fact that they study business. That strikes me as odd. Why would you study something and potentially dedicate your life to something if you're not proud of it, if indeed you're embarrassed by it? And I think part of the answer might be that when they're asked, or when people ask, why would you study business, or why would you potentially dedicate your life to it? It seems like the total universe of possible responses is just these 2. Either you want to get a job or you want to make money. Well, I mean, do business students want to get a job and make money? I'm sure they do. Is that true for other students at colleges and universities? I'm sure it is. But even if it is true, those don't seem like particularly inspiring reasons to go into anything. And as I often tell my students, just to make money is not a good reason to do anything. So I think the interesting question is, can there be anything else, any other purpose that business might serve? And I'd invite you to consider this analogy between these 2 professions, medicine and business. So both of them are professions. In both of them, you have specialties, you have subspecialties. In both cases, there is technical knowledge you would have to learn in order to succeed. And in both cases, in order to succeed, you probably need a great deal of experience. So it could be a lot of training, both technical training and experiential training that you would require. And in both cases, if you're successful, you might make a lot of money. But consider for a second how differently those 2 fields, those 2 professions are viewed by the wider culture. So for example, nobody says to the medical doctor, well, now that you've made your money, you need to give back to society. But they do say that to the business professional. So think about that for a second. When you were a child, if your mother told you you need to give that back, what does that mean you did? Well, it means you stole something. You did something wrong and you now need to make amends. Well, is that what people think about business when they say that business people should give back? Notice they don't usually say business people should give. They say they should give back. So do people think that if you were successful in business, somewhere, somehow along the way, you must have done something wrong? I think the answer is yes. That is exactly what people think. So let's ask that as a question. Is business the kind of activity that if you engage in it, you need to atone for it afterwards? So here's my suggestion, and this is the suggestion that I make to my students and I've made to my colleagues here in the business school. If we review all of the arguments, say, in favor of a market economy or in favor of business, and then we also review all of the objections or worries, concerns that people raise about business or a market economy, if after doing all of that, we come to the conclusion that yes, business is the sort of thing that one needs to atone for, you need to give back to make up for something inevitably wrong that you will have done, then my suggestion is we shouldn't ask business people to give back. What we should do is instead tell them not to go into it in the first place. I mean, you wouldn't tell a thief, go ahead and keep stealing as long as you give some of what you steal to charity. What you say to the thief is stop stealing. So if business really is the sort of activity for which one needs to atone, then I think what we should do is have the courage of our convictions and say, don't go into it in the first place. Okay, so what's the alternative then? If we're going to continue to have business schools or educate people in business or go into business as a profession, then I think we need to figure out some way of describing at least some business behavior such that it's valuable in itself. So not necessarily for what it might do afterwards, but the actual activity of business itself should be valuable. And if not, if we can't come up with that way, then I think we need to close down the business schools. So my question that I'd like to talk about today is there an answer to this question that's morally justifiable? Why would we go into business? Why have business? Can we make a moral argument for it? So let me construct my argument. So I would begin with Aristotle in thinking about Aristotle's description of human beings. So human beings, according to Aristotle, have a hierarchy of purposes or a hierarchy of ends. What that means, and this might be, for Aristotle, this was uniquely for human beings as opposed to other kinds of creatures. But what this means is that we have proximate or near-term ends, things we want to accomplish today or tomorrow or then in this week, during the next week. Those are in turn in service of longer-term ends, what we want to achieve in a year or 2 years or 5 years, and so on until we get to the ultimate end. The ultimate end for Aristotle is the final goal that we want all of the previous things we did in life to lead up to. It's the end not for which we do something else, but the final end we hope to achieve. So Aristotle said that this ultimate end for human beings is what he called eudaimonia. That's a transliteration of his word. It's a bit hard to translate. It's often translated as happiness, but it's not happiness in the sense of contentment or just a mere momentary pleasure. It's happiness in the sense of being cognizant of a life well and fully lived. So using all of the time, talent, and treasure, all of the opportunities available to one in the service of ends that you think are worthy. And so the idea is that in order to construct a rationally ordered moral life, what you need to do is to imagine yourself at the end of your life. So think about when you're 120 years old and you're looking back on the life you led. What kind of life do you want to have led such that at that final stage of your life, you will look back on it and say, that was a life worthy of having been led. So if you try to imagine now what that life would look like, then what you're required to do then is to reverse engineer all the way back to today. So what do you need to be doing 20 years from now in order to achieve that life? 10 years, 5 years, a month today. That means we need to connect our daily practices all the way up to our proper ultimate ends in order to have a rationally ordered moral life. Okay, so now that's in general. How does that relate to business? Well, this is what I would like to suggest. I want to construct a similar sort of hierarchy for business, and here are my 5 steps. So at the highest level, our ultimate social end is, I would suggest, we want a just and humane society. Wherever we are in the political or economic spectrum, everybody wants a just and humane society. Now we're going to have different definitions of what just and humane are, so let me be a little bit more specific. My second step is that a just and humane society depends on a variety of institutions. So this is going to include political institutions, economic institutions, maybe moral or cultural institutions. So the Just and Humane Society won't be possible unless we have the right kinds of these public social institutions. Now, I don't think those two steps are so controversial. I haven't yet defined just and humane. I'll come back to that in a second. But I think this step is a little bit more controversial. One of those, not the only one, but one of those institutions that is included in a just and humane society, that's JHS, is a properly functioning market economy. Now that is a little more controversial. And of course, the word properly is doing a lot of work there. So what exactly do we mean by do I mean by a properly functioning market economy? I'd say it's one based on what I'm going to call and define as honorable business. So what is honorable business? Fifth and final step. Honorable business is industries, firms, and individuals creating what I'm going to call genuine value. What I mean by that is making not only their own, but others' lives genuinely better. And that's an important qualifier, genuinely. That's not a throwaway term. I mean that, that quite robustly. I'll come back and talk about that in just a little bit. But here's my idea. If you have business people and firms who are creating value according to this hierarchy, then they're actually contributing to this hierarchy of purpose. And if they're doing it right, big if they're doing it right, then one can improve one's own life in one way and in one way only, and that is by improving other people's lives at the same time, simultaneously. Okay, so let me step back and explain a little bit about this. First of all, this question that I inevitably get is why does this, especially from business students, why are we talking about Aristotle if we're talking about honorable business? Why does this matter? Well, here's one reason it matters. This is a rather astonishing chart. So take a look at this. This is world gross. So the total amount of wealth produced in the world over the last 2 millennia, all adjusted for inflation in 2011 dollars. And as it goes back from year one, so 2020 years ago to today, as you can see, that is quite a hockey stick. So for most of the last 2,000 years, there was very little wealth at all produced anywhere in the world. You begin to see some upticks in the 16th century, a little bit more in the 17th century. Then in the 18th and 19th century, it really takes off to today, completely unprecedented levels. So the levels of wealth that we have in the real wealth that we have in the world today has never been seen before in human history. So you and I are lucky, blessed enough to be living at a time where there is more wealth in the world than there has ever been. And here's one other way to look at it. This is per capita. So the previous slide showed you total wealth. This is per capita wealth. The blue line was calculated by Angus Madison going back from today back to the year 1, so the last 2,000 years. The red line is calculated by Brad DeLong, who's an economist at Berkeley. This goes all the way back to 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. As you can see, again, that is quite a hockey stick. And if you're a social scientist looking at a graph like this, I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor, but if you're looking at a graph like this, well, none of this is what's interesting. What's interesting is this. What happens? What changed? So something dramatic changed around the 18th century that led to the totally unprecedented levels of wealth that we enjoy today. Well, what is it? What exactly changed? Maybe you have your theories about it, but let me give you my suggestion. So the big question is what changed? What caused this change? My answer is it was a shift in morality. So it wasn't an institutional change first. I think the change in morality came first, and then institutions and practices began to follow. So here's what I mean by that. Think about this. Suppose somebody else has something you want. It could be anything. It could be a laptop. It could be a labor. Maybe you want their labor. Maybe you would like them to work for you. Their love. It could be anything. But let's stick with laptop. That's an easier case to talk about. Suppose somebody else has a laptop you want. There are 2 ways that you can get that from them, aren't there? Well, two different categories. One of them is you could steal it from them. So maybe you kill them, take it. Maybe you steal it from them when they're not looking. Maybe you defraud them out of it. You promise to pay something and they agree to what you promised, and then you take it, but then you don't pay, you abscond with it. That's one way. We might call all of those ways extraction. That's one way. What's the other way? Well, the other way is I could make you an offer that you're free to accept or decline, and if you accept it, then we exchange. So those 2 ways are really the only 2 ways you can get something from somebody else, either extraction, which is, as I said, theft, slavery, imperialism, colonization, fraud, etc., or the other way I'll call cooperation. That's voluntary exchange or partnership or association. Now, if you think about those two ways, which of those two ways is the tried and true human method that human beings and human groups, societies throughout our history have used almost exclusively? It's extraction. You think about the civilizations of the past, the Egyptian pharaohs who built the pyramids, the Romans who built the Colosseum and the aqueducts and the roads, the Song dynasty in China. Those were parts of human history, societies in human history that had a great deal of wealth. Well, how did they get it? They got it through extraction, theft, slavery, imperialism, etc. That's one big reason I would argue for why that long, low red line I showed you was so long, low, and red, long and low, because when you're just taking things from one person, you're not actually increasing the wealth, you're just moving it from one place to another. So that's an example of a zero-sum exchange. It could even be negative sum, but it's a zero-sum exchange. If I take your laptop from you, well, that's -1 laptop for you, +1 laptop for me, +1 plus -1 is 0. There's no net increase in wealth. It's just simply a transfer from one place to another. But contrast that with cooperation. If I make you an offer for your laptop, say I offer you $1,000 for your laptop and you agree, you give me the laptop, I give you the $1,000. If we both voluntarily agreed to that, then which of us benefited from that exchange? Well, likely both of us did. Otherwise, if either one of us didn't think we benefited from it, we wouldn't have done it. But if we both voluntarily did it, then that must mean that you valued the $1,000 more than the laptop. I valued the laptop more than the $1,000. So it's positive value for you, positive value for me. Positive value plus positive value is positive. So it's called positive sum exchange. So my suggestion is that what changed in human history is that people began to think that extraction was unacceptable, even morally unacceptable, but that cooperation was not only allowable, but even praiseworthy, morally praiseworthy. Now that might strike you as obvious, but I promise you it wasn't obvious for a lot of human history. And by the way, it's still not obvious to everybody in the world today. But let me ask you two questions. Between the two, extraction and cooperation, which one of them is more moral? Well, I hope the answer is obvious. That should be an easy question. I think it's cooperation is more moral. But let me ask this question. Which of them leads to increasing prosperity? Well, by a stroke of spectacular good luck, it's exactly the same one. So here's the argument I would suggest. Here's my suggestion. What I want to call honorable business is cooperative business, plus just a bit more. So the first thing is that it's engaging in only voluntary exchange that is positive sum. That's the cooperative part of it. And I would claim that honorable business, in order to be truly honorable, there's a little bit more that we have to do. And I'll come to that in just a second. So now let me talk about that now. So what is honorable business? The first rule of honorable business, I would argue, is never to engage in extractive behavior ever, under no circumstances. So think of it like the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is first, do no harm. That's the oath that medical doctors have traditionally taken. First, do no harm. I would say there should be the first rule of honorable business should be something similar, which is never benefit oneself at another's unwilling expense. So it's never acceptable to benefit yourself at another's expense by extracting wealth, resources, et cetera, land, or anything else from them at their unwilling expense. So that's the first rule of honorable business. But the second just follows from that. If extractive behavior is ruled out, then the only way that is allowed, both logically, but I would argue morally, for us to engage with other people is through cooperative behavior. So cooperative behavior only. What does that mean? That means to treat all parties with equal respect for their autonomy and their dignity. And in practice, the way to do that is by respecting what I call their opt-out option. Their opt-out option is their right to say no thank you and go elsewhere. In other words, to any offer, demand, proposal that anyone makes, everybody should have the right to say no thanks and go somewhere else. And if we respect that right, if we honor that right, then that means that the only way we can actually exchange with others, transact with them, partner with them, associate with them, the only way we can do it is with their willing consent. That means that cooperative behavior, if I want to engage in cooperative behavior, if I want to benefit myself, the only way I can do it is by thinking about how I can benefit you according to your own lives, your own values. So cooperative behavior only, which means to respect everyone's opt-out option. It also means to honor our promises, even when no one is looking. That's an important part of what a cooperative behavior is. If you give your promise, keep it. If you don't want to keep a promise, then don't give it. And third, and this is the plus a bit more I mentioned just a second ago, I think we're positively called, we have a positive moral obligation to provide, not only not to harm others, not only to refrain from, say, stealing or from others or defrauding them, but actually a positive commitment, obligation to engage in positive behavior to provide genuine value to others. And that's a two-way street. So the kinds of exchanges, transactions that are involved in cooperative behavior, the kinds of partnerships are ones that benefit both or all parties and create genuine benefit to both or all parties. If we're doing that, then honorable business is not only positive sum, as I was describing it just a second ago, meaning it's a win-win, but I would argue that in fact it's a win-win-win. So it's not just that you and I both benefit when we exchange your laptop for my money. Both of us have a positive sum. So that's a positive sum transaction because both of us benefited. But that also entails or implies benefit for others as well, because the more such exchanges we engage in, the more overall prosperity we generate, with which not only we, but other people also can then begin to turn their attention to the satisfaction of other needs, desires, values that they have. That's what explains or accounts for that sudden uptick, that huge hockey stick. It's like the miracle of compounding interest. Okay, so in the interest of time, what I would like to do, that gives you a sketch of my proposal about honorable business. But I would like to address one important worry that people have about the kind of honorable business, the cooperative business I'm describing, especially if it takes place in a market economy, and that is inequality. So is it the case that the kind of honor, if we have a set of institutions that allows the honorable business I'm talking about, that there can be inequalities in wealth, material inequalities? Yes, there can be. So let me ask this question: should justice address wealth inequality? So now I'm not talking about wealth inequality that arises from extraction. So I think that's a clear case. If there are injustices that occur through theft, slavery, colonization, fraud, et cetera, those are clearly unjust cases. But what if you have wealth inequality that arises only through cooperative behavior only? Does that itself, or can that itself, rise to a level of requiring addressing by justice? So let me give you a quick thought experiment about this. Suppose we have two people, A and B. I'm not going to tell you who they are, but I'm going to tell you this. A is much wealthier than B. So we have two people, A is wealthier than B. Let's raise the stakes a little bit and say that A has 100 times as much wealth as B. Okay, now without knowing anything else about who our A and B are, or what their situations are you inclined to think, and I'll just ask you to think about this on your own, are you inclined to think that it's automatically a failure of justice, or perhaps you prefer the term social justice, if a society is structured so that one person can be worth 100 times as much as another person? So without knowing anything else about him, do you think it must be an unjust society if one person can have 100 times as much wealth as another person? Okay, so while you're thinking about your answer to that, let me tell you who my A and B are. So here's A. I don't know whether you recognize him. That's Bill Gates. There he is. I guess he's probably saying, "Thank God I live in a capitalist country," or something. I guess that's what he's doing. What is Bill Gates's worth? Well, I checked it this morning. As of this morning, it could have changed during the day, I suppose, but as of this morning, he was worth $131 billion. That doesn't make him the richest person in the world, but he's up there in the top 5. So who's a person who would have only 1/100th as much as Bill Gates? Now, there are lots of people I might have picked, but I picked somebody who used to be a former neighbor of mine. Do you recognize him? That's Michael Jordan. Okay, he wasn't actually a neighbor of mine. I used to live in North Carolina. He also lived in North Carolina, so I guess I can claim him as a neighbor. I never actually met him. What's Michael Jordan's net worth? So I checked this morning. His net worth has gone up a bit. So he used to be about 1/100th of Bill Gates. It's a little less than that. He's worth $1.6 billion as of today. So that's about 1/82nd as much as Bill Gates. But if you think I'm dating myself with Michael Jordan, I don't know how many people still remember Michael Jordan. I can't imagine people not knowing who that is. But here's somebody more recent. Do you recognize that person? That's Kim Kardashian West. So as of this morning, she's worth $1 billion, which is about 131th, if that's how that's said, of Bill Gates as well. Okay. Now, these are extreme examples. Obviously, these are way out on the upper tail of wealth. But what are these examples supposed to show? Here's what I think they show. When you're evaluating the moral case of inequality, I think these are the two questions that we have to pay attention to. First of all, how did the wealthier person get it? So whichever one is wealthier, did that person engage in theft, fraud, colonization, etc.? In other words, did that person get the wealth through extraction, or is it through voluntary cooperation, positive sum cooperation? That's the first question. How did that person get it? And second, what's the absolute quality of B's life, of the poorer person's life? So Michael Jordan is extremely, and Kim Kardashian West are extremely poor relative to Bill Gates. But in absolute terms, they seem to be doing quite fine on their own. So the idea that we should transfer some of Bill Gates's wealth to Michael Jordan or to Kim Kardashian West seems absurd, because their lives are already pretty good, even if by relative standards to Bill Gates, they're extremely poor. But of course, these are very extreme examples. So are there wealth differentials that are greater than 100 times? So let's think about the United States. Are there people in the United States who have not just 100 times as much wealth as others, but 1,000 times? Yes. How about 10,000 times? Yes. Let's raise it another order of magnitude, 100,000 times. Yes, there are. We could go even farther. So what about someone who's making only 1/250,000th of Bill Gates's wealth? So has only this tiny fraction. So you might think, well, this is somebody who must be soldiering on in relative misery to be worth only 1/250,000th of Bill Gates's wealth. Well, who's that person? Yeah, that's me. Actually, I rounded up just to make it a round number. So what's that supposed to make? The point is that's supposed to make. So here's the question I would ask. When you're worried about inequality, if you could change one thing in the world, but only one thing, either poverty or inequality. In other words, if you could eliminate poverty in the world, or you could eliminate inequality, but not both, which would you eliminate? Now, I think your answer to that question is going to go some way towards describing the system of political economy that you might endorse. But I'll tell you what my answer is, and I'm happy to talk about this in question and answers, but my answer to that is poverty. I think poverty is a much greater cause of misery in human life than is inequality. And I don't think this is merely a philosophical issue, because it looks as though, historically speaking, so we've done quite a bit of work on in the history of economics, it looks as though the institutions we have been able to figure out that enable people to rise out of that long, low red line of poverty, historical norms of poverty, the institutions that we finally figured out that enable people to rise out of them are the same institutions that also allow people to have differentials of wealth. By contrast, the only way it looks like we can keep people relatively equal in wealth is if they're relatively equally poor. So we seem to be faced with this actual trade-off. Either we can have more prosperity, but with inequality, or we can have more equality, but less prosperity. So I think that's a real question. Okay, so let me come to my conclusion. I asked this question at the beginning. What's a good answer? Is there a morally justifiable reason to go into business? Here's my answer for your consideration. What I would say is, because honorable business, as I have defined it, is cooperative, that means it treats people with dignity and respect. That's the opt-out option. You have to respect other people's wishes, which means you have to meet them as peers. If you can't coerce them or force them or extract from them, then that means the only way you can partner or exchange with them is if they willingly consent, which means you have to show them respect and respect their dignity. Because honorable business seeks to create mutual benefit, and that's the only way that you can get actually a cooperative exchange, it therefore leads to increasing overall prosperity. Each one of those positive sum transactions raises the overall prosperity, even if only marginally, only incrementally. But as you have thousands and millions and billions of those kinds of transactions, then that begins to generate quite a bit of prosperity. But that prosperity can only be, I think, morally justified if it constitutes what I would call genuine value. So one of the mistakes I think people who make arguments in favor of market economies often make is that they think if an exchange or partnership is mutually voluntary, that's all you need to say. There's no further question, no further argument that needs to be made. As long as it's voluntary, anything that's peaceful or anything that's voluntary goes. I don't think that's quite true, because there are many, I think that's necessary. Being mutually voluntary is necessary to endorse an exchange, but it's not sufficient, because there are plenty of mutually voluntary exchanges we might engage in that actually are not good for people. So I think we still have to bring our moral judgment to bear. Not all preferences are good preferences, so not all preferences should be satisfied. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should ask a third party or ask the government or something to prevent people. There are plenty of things that I think might be legal, but could still be immoral. So I think we have to think about, I think an honorable business person thinks, not only are other people willing to partner with me or buy from me or sell to me, but is what I'm doing actually creating genuine value in both my life and in their lives? And I would also add, and this is a bit more controversial, just adding to the list of things that are controversial, but I think waste could actually be understood as a moral failure. What I mean by waste is, if we're not positively using all of the opportunities available to us, all of our time, talent, and treasure, to create positive value, not only for ourselves, but for others at the same time, then I think, and this is what I mean by waste, if we're just not doing anything, we might not be causing harm to people, but we're preventing the good or the positive value we could have created in other people's lives. So I think that can actually be understood as a moral failure. We are called to do all of the things we can with the resources we have in order to create positive value in other people's lives. So what is the end or purpose that one should have in mind when engaging in business? I would say to use all of one's time, talent, and treasure to benefit oneself and others at the same time. And in this way, I think, given this list of things I have here, what you can get from honorable business is not only prosperity, but also morality. And so understood, I would argue that honorable business could even be seen as a moral calling. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate that. And the floor is now open for questions. I have one that I'll throw out there, if you don't mind, Dina.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. You touched on this a little bit right at the end, but I wonder if you might flesh it out a little bit. So when you talk about genuine value, do you mean eudaimonia? So basically, to be an honorable business, you have to contribute to other people's lives well lived in that full sense, sort of retrospectively over your life. This is how you would want to have lived it. If so, is that pretty demanding? I mean, I could see how this might relate to businesses that provide services that might satisfy people's preferences, but not their best sense of themselves, like let's say pornography. Would you apply it to that kind of issue? And is this standard maybe too demanding?
Excellent question, and a hard one. So thank you for starting out with a hard question. But I would apply it to industries like pornography. So I think what that means is, so I'll go back to the beginning of your question. Your question was, is eudaimonia really what I have in mind when talking about genuine value? The short answer is yes, that is what I have in mind. But your sort of the pivot of your question is, or the key part of your question is that too demanding of a standard? So I have enough of a skeptical view about human nature about the limits of human knowledge to think that we don't always know what's in other people's best interests. And in fact, I think we often don't know what's in other people's best interests. So there's a large range of cases where I think we have to think, well, you're going to know best what's in your best interest, and I'll leave that to you, and maybe justifiably leave that to you to be the best steward of what's in your best interest, what constitutes genuine value in your life. But I do think that from each of our individual perspectives, so my perspective and yours respectively, I think what we have to do, what I think we're morally called to do, is to think, well, Is the product I'm producing or the service I'm wanting to engage in or whatever the business partnership or anything else that I'm thinking about doing, is this something that if I were on the other side of this, do I think this would actually improve my life? Do I think that if I were on the other side of the transaction, this would constitute an actual genuine value on my road to eudaimonia? If the answer is I'm not sure, well, okay, in good faith. If I say I'm not sure, well, then maybe the default is I'm going to leave that to you, assuming you're a normally functioning adult. I'll leave that to you to decide. But if the answer is no, then I think that's a red flag. Then if I'm pretty sure that whatever this good or services I'm providing that I myself would not welcome it in my life or in my family's life or in the life of my friends or the people I care about, I think that's a red flag. And even if I can make money doing it, I think that's a reason to think about dedicating my life to something else. So it is a relatively demanding standard. I concede that to you, but I don't think it's overcomable because I do think there is an area where we can say, well, I'm not quite sure. I think the only area, and of course, there's also the yes. If I think yes, that's the best case. But if I think the answer is absolutely no, I think in those cases, yes, I think we need to, that's a red flag.
Thank you, Jim. Lena, do you have anything?
Yes, so I think this question is from the audience and it may follow kind of nicely up with Jason's question. And this is from the audience and it says, can you interpret business behavior such as we see in Uber and Bitcoin in terms of honorable businesses?
Well, so is the question meaning, do I think those are honorable businesses or are things like that potentially honorable?
I think it's asking probably for your interpretation.
Yeah.
Of how do you view these businesses, if they are, or I guess if they could become, if you don't think they are.
So I think the idea for both of those businesses is perfectly honorable. So in other words, I want to separate for just a second. Let's take Uber as an example. Let's separate for a second the idea of creating a ride sharing company like that. So what I think Uber does, or the idea of Uber and Lyft and other companies like that, what they're really doing is just reducing transaction costs. So there are people who need rides. There are other people who would like to be able to give rides. They have dead assets. Maybe, they have a car that sits in the driveway all day and doesn't do anything. So these are assets that can be used. There are other people who would like to be able to use them. And so these kinds of companies, and there are lots of others. I think Airbnb is another, but there are lots of companies like this. And what they're effectively doing is enabling more mutually voluntary and mutually beneficial transactions, lowering the transaction costs to enable more of those to happen. So as more of that happens, yes, I think those are positive sum transactions, and I think they can be perfectly honorable. Where it gets a little murkier, and this is why I asked you that question, are we talking specifically about Uber and its practices, or just sort of the idea of these kinds of companies? When it comes to the company Uber itself, or to any company, there I think we actually need to take a look at the particulars. So are there people who are coming in as employees? Well, I don't know exactly what we're supposed to call Uber, people who work for Uber anymore. I don't know, they're subcontractors or employees. That makes a legal distinction, but the people who are working with Uber or working, driving the cars for Uber, are they signing up for something that they didn't realize they were signing up for example? Did they believe they were getting something and in fact they're getting something different? Or the people who are hailing the rides and the people who ride in the cars, did they think, and were there some deceptive practices going on that led them to believe they would get some kind of service or maybe be charged at some level and something else happened? The answer to those kinds of questions, I think, those should influence our judgment about whether the particular practices of a place like Uber or any other company are actually moral or honorable, as I call it. But I think in general, those kinds of businesses, I think they can certainly be honorable. But Bitcoin, you asked me about Bitcoin.
Yes,
I don't know what to think about Bitcoin. Yeah, Bitcoin is this bizarre animal that, it seems to have a lot of value. Nobody really, I don't think, quite knows what the value is going to be. I think all of it is basically still prospective. Jason is probably an expert on it. He probably owns a lot of Bitcoin for all I know. I think still, it's $50,000 or whatever it is now, the price of it. It's extremely volatile. It makes me very nervous, not only because of its volatility, but also because all of that value seems to be based on what people are guessing down the road Bitcoin might be able to be used for, but not what it's being used for now. I don't have any objection to people risking their own money. If people want to speculate their money with something like that, I say, more power to you. But for myself, just speaking for myself, it makes me very nervous. I'm not sure that's an answer to your question, but I'm just telling you my own thoughts about it.
No, thank you.
Here's
Jay,
another good
another
question
one? Yeah,
from
go
the
ahead.
audience. What role do you envision honorable business having with respect to politics, or how politically engaged should honorable business be?
Yes, that's another good and hard question. So if you have a chance to take a look at my book, I spend quite a bit of time talking about this issue. So what I think might sort of be in the mind of that questioner is, what about cronyism? So is cronyism a species of honorable business? So, what goes on in the United States? Well, a lot of companies in the United States, in fact, almost all companies after they reach a certain size, spend a lot of money on lobbying. And what do they do with that lobbying? Well, they're trying to get legislation or regulation tilted in their favor. Sometimes it's defensive, meaning they're trying to defend themselves against other people doing things or something, but oftentimes it's to get things tilted in their own favor. I think those are species of cronyism, and by cronyism I mean this is when certain businesses or firms or industries, or in other parts of the world, you get families that get special protections, they get special subsidies. So maybe they're protected against competition. They might get their losses subsidized. Maybe they get special charters or special monopolies. They're the only ones who get to engage in this business activity in this region or this area or whatever it is. I think all of those are in various ways species of what I call extraction. In other words, what they are is using the mechanism of government to provide value or to extract value for themselves at the expense of unwilling others. So, I mean, that's painting with a very broad brush, but I think all of those cronyist activities, which might be what your questioner was thinking of, I don't think those are honorable activities. Now, here's one caveat or one qualification I would make. Suppose you want to be an honorable business person and you're in a country in which you're surrounded by people engaging in cronyism. If you're the only one, you unilaterally, this becomes a collective action problem now. So I unilaterally decide not to engage in it, and what happens? I'm at a competitive disadvantage to all of the people who are engaging in it, so I'm just going to go out of business. And so in that way, cronyism can be something like, its own spiral downward. It encourages and incentivizes everybody to engage in it. So there I would say that a person wanting to engage in honorable business who is surrounded by people who are engaging in what I would call dishonorable business, I think the way you have to, I think the way you have to think about what you're doing is, if you have to engage in activities defensively, then maybe you get a pass, but only if it's defensive, not if it's on the offense, meaning not if you're actively seeking out special favors, but you're just trying to protect yourself against other people getting special favors against you or at your expense. Then I think it can be justified, but only in that limited way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Well, I think we can go with another question from the audience. They're coming in. So here we have about somebody saying, thinking about Facebook, and it says, I always thought Facebook would be a much more honorable organization if they were a nonprofit. Is there a distinction that you make that separates the public from nonprofit that makes nonprofit more honorable? Is it mission? What are your thoughts on that?
There I think I would dissent from what's probably the common view, which is that I don't think being a nonprofit necessarily makes a corporation, so a nonprofit corporation versus a for-profit corporation. I don't think those two designations necessarily mean that one is more moral than the other. The mission and activities that they engage in, I think that's really where I would look. What exactly are they creating positive value in the world? That can certainly go on, I think, in both in the for-profit world, but also in the nonprofit world. One of the difficulties I would say that nonprofits have. So if you think about, nonprofits tend to operate, depending on what kind of nonprofit we're talking about, but many of them, if it's charity, for example, it's going to tend to operate on the basis of donations. People give money to it. It takes the money that they get in the service of whatever its mission is, and it uses that money in the service of the particular mission that it's set up to do. One of the difficulties that nonprofits often face that is not exactly the same that for-profits face is that it's oftentimes difficult for a nonprofit to know exactly what the best way to spend its limited resources is. because they don't have, in the same way that a for-profit company would, they don't have clients or customers in the same way who can choose among different options. So Joseph Schumpeter, the early 20th century economist who's famous for the creative destruction phrase, he also talked about how in what can happen to businesses and markets, if there is a competitive economy, is that there's something that we might call back-end discipline. So not front-end discipline. Front-end discipline is legislation, regulation, where we try to limit what bad things, say, companies can do by not letting them do these bad things in the first place, ruling them out by law or by regulation. Back-end discipline is the discipline that applies when consumers, customers, clients, etc., can say no thank you and go somewhere else. So if the only way you can make money as a for-profit company is if people come into you and voluntarily are willing to part with some of their money for whatever you're offering, but they can go somewhere else if they want, then that imposes a kind of discipline on you. In other words, it means that you have to pay attention to what they're interested in. In the nonprofit world, that signal that you get from outsiders is a little bit more, there's a little bit more noise to signal ratio, in the sense that it's not always as clear that you're using your resources in the most productive way that you could be. It just is harder. It's not impossible, but that's harder. I think that puts a little bit more of an onus on the people in a nonprofit to be constantly thinking about, they just really have to constantly think about, are we serving our mission? And is everything we're doing, every penny we get, to the extent we can, directed to the mission first and foremost? I think that's much more difficult. But I think in either case, either of them could be honorable or dishonorable, depending on the activities they engage in.
Thank you. Jason or Max, I don't know, Max, if you had a question too, but we can.
I do.
Max, go ahead.
I actually have a couple questions, but I think I'll just start with one. Okay, so going back to that email that the center received, I guess I have a question. Does capitalism in general encourage the extractive behavior or perhaps the cooperative behavior? In other words, are moral rules then a regulation upon business behavior, or something that might emerge more organically from a cooperation that's an inherent in business? In other words, inherently, business activity, is it more extractive, in which case we need moral regulations, good lectures by people like you to encourage people to be good, or is it, if we let markets function on their own and people engage in transactions on their own, naturally they'll engage in more cooperative behavior, and the extractive people are just a few rotten apples, or perhaps distortions in the market?
Well, that's a lot. There are a lot of pieces of that, Max.
Okay.
So first, about capitalism. So the term capitalism, I don't like to use that term. I don't use that word because people mean very different things by that term. And usually when you start a discussion with an ism like capitalism or communism or socialism, what you end up getting is people sort of dig their heels in, and they're going to defend, they have their version, and they tend to caricature the other, whatever the opposing version is. But I think really the key part of your question is what kinds of behavior does, say, what's the alternative, a market economy, what kinds of behavior does that encourage? What does it discourage? And are things like extraction or maybe greed? I think in that email that you read, there was something about greed maybe in there. Does it encourage these kinds of behaviors? So here's a way to think about this. Greed is one of the seven deadly sins. It's been a seven deadly sin for a very long time. So it predates anything that we would today call capitalism or market economies. I think, I'll just speak for myself now, my view is that is an endemic and enduring failure of the human character, part of the human condition. So there has never been a time when people weren't susceptible to the vice of greed. And there never will be a time when people aren't susceptible to the vice of greed. So given that, then I think what we're dealing with is a world of second best. So I think imagining a perfect world in which nobody was greedy and everybody only thought of everybody else first, that maybe that'll happen in heaven or something, but that's probably not ever going to happen on earth. So we're dealing in second bests. And once you come into the realm of second best, if you're willing to allow me that, then I would say, well, what we need to do is to figure out not how do we get rid of that, but given if we assume that there will be people who will be who would have had if they had the opportunity to engage in extraction or to be greedy, or to arrogate to themselves not just wealth but power and other things, more than they should. So at that point, I think we need to think about what are the institutions that can channel that in positive directions, so that people, even despite themselves, even despite the vices they may have in their characters, it's much more difficult for them to actually punish other people. In other words, benefit themselves at other people's expense. Now, if that's the area of conversation, if that's the space we're talking about, then I would say, so I'm not an anarchist. Maybe there are some people in your audience or on the screen who are anarchists. What I would say is, if you have a government that protects people's persons, meaning their bodily persons, you can't kill, enslave, assault people, protects their property, meaning if you own something, nobody gets to take it or despoil it or trespass on it without your permission. And then also the third thing that we can think of, these are the 3 Ps, that your person, your property, and your voluntary promises or your contracts. You make an agreement with somebody, you're kept to your agreement. If we have those things, then what I think you can get, and I think what a lot of the historical stuff I was sort of gesturing at in my talk suggests, is that when you have institutions that protect those things, almost no matter what else is going on, people will begin to engage in positive sum cooperative transactions all on their own, generating wealth and mutual benefit. So that doesn't mean people won't be greedy. That doesn't mean people won't try to break the rules. But if you have robust institutions that protect person, property, and promise, and that punish people for violating those, then you tend to get a lot more, it seems as though, this is the historical argument, you get a lot more people who develop a kind of culture around those things where they begin to think the only proper way to deal with others is by respecting their opt-out options, is by making them offers instead of engaging in extraction. I don't think we'll ever get away from having people who will do that. But what that might do is minimize the effectiveness of such people or the damage such people can do. And then a bit, one hopes anyway, channel some of that behavior into even unwitting positive directions for the rest of us.
Great, thanks, Jim. I did have a follow-up, if I could, a quick one. Maybe
Okay.
It's not so quick, but you did talk about, institutional structures or changes that can promote good behavior and kind of cooperative business behavior. I'm wondering if there are any institutional changes you would support that would help us to eliminate poverty, which seems to be, one of these endemic conditions that we are afflicted with, or do you think that we don't need to do anything special? We need to continue encouraging honorable business behavior. What would you say?
Good question. And, I would say there are 2 different levels at which I would take that question. So one is sort of the institutional level and the other one is the personal level. At the personal level, quasi-personal level, I think that's what I would suggest what you said at the end, which is each of us should make personal commitments to improve not only our own lives, but other people's lives to the extent we can, given the resources available to us and the constraints we face. But so I do think that's a personal moral obligation. On the other hand, at the institutional level, the antidote to poverty is prosperity. So one of the things I think we should avoid, one way I think we should avoid thinking about poverty is that the goal of institutional programs, say, or policies to address poverty, it should not be to enable poor people to be more comfortable amidst their poverty. And I think a lot of people sort of make that mistake. We think that, well, we just want them to be comfortable. We don't want them to rise out of poverty. What we want them to do is to be more comfortable in their poverty. I think that's not a way to show respect for human persons. I think the way that we show genuine respect for the dignity of everyone, including poor people, is to figure out a way for them to rise out of poverty. And rising out of poverty means generating more prosperity. That's really the antidote. So in terms of absolute, so you said that, poverty seems to be an endemic, part of our lives. Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. Well, if by that he meant the relatively poor, so some people will be poorer than others, that's certainly true. I mean, that will always be the case unless everybody's exactly identical. But in absolute terms, that I think we're actually making quite a bit of headway in addressing. So the United Nations defines absolute poverty as something like $3 per person per day or less. So if you're living on $3 a day or less, then you're at the level of what the United Nations calls absolute poverty. Well, the proportion of people in the world who were living at that level or lower in 1900, so 121 years ago, in 1900 was about 90%, 90% of the world 90% of the world population lived at that level or lower. What is it today? Today, that level is about 8.5%. It has never been lower than that in all of human history. So we are making tremendous strides in allowing billions and now hundreds of millions and now billions of people to rise out of that. So I think we are making a lot of headway. And I think one of the risks we would run, or one of the mistakes we might make, is by jeopardizing the institutions that have enabled all of those people to rise out of poverty. So if the antidote to poverty is prosperity, then I think that means we have to think about, well, what really are the institutions, and then what are our personal obligations that actually generate that prosperity.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think in terms of time, you think we have time for one more question, or basically, I don't want to hold anybody. I know it is, we're a little bit over time, actually. Jason, your call.
Well, we do have a couple other questions, but we've run out of time, so I think we should probably wrap it up. But
I would be happy if anybody wanted to email me with questions or engage with me, I'd be happy to have them do so. So please extend my invitation.
Absolutely. And what's your email address for that? Are
We
you
can
happy giving
share
that
it
out?
later, yeah.
Okay. I had it at the end of my slide, but it's just my name, J Otteson @nd.edu.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. Jason, do you want to close? I can
Oh,
close.
thanks.
I want to thank Jim for his very insightful remarks. I feel a little more positive about the human race after your talk today, especially coming from that email that we received at the center. So we really, I think it was an inspiring talk, and one that directly addressed the question that email posed, and the role that businesses can play in a just and humane society. So thank you for your remarks. Thank you, Dina and Jason, for your wonderful moderating skills. And to Hannah Abodri, our program coordinator, who managed the technical details of this. I'd like to thank all of the audience for your questions and comments, and for tuning in today for the latest in our series, Corporations in the Common Good. Please keep an eye on upcoming events and programs at anselm.edu/ethics. And we will be sending out a recording of this to all of you who registered next week. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.